She was not Egyptian by blood, yet Egypt bowed before her. She was not Roman, yet Rome trembled at her name. She spoke 9 languages and ruled an empire, and history buried her alive. We were told she seduced 2 of the most powerful men in the world, but seduction was not her weapon. Intelligence was. Her beauty has become a legend, but neither beauty nor charm explains how she survived civil war, famine, and assassination attempts for 21 years of unbroken rule. The year is 48 BC. Julius Caesar has just arrived in Alexandria. A woman is rolled inside a cloth sack, carried past armed guards, and unrolled at his feet. That woman was Cleopatra VII, and she had not come to beg. She had come to negotiate the future of the ancient world. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra is wrong, or at least it comes from the people who defeated her and rewrote everything afterward. Her statues were destroyed, her temples were converted, her story was rewritten by the men and the empire that killed her. But the evidence survives. In papyrus fragments, temple walls, and coins minted with her real face, the truth is still legible, if you know where to look. She was the last of the Ptolemies, a dynasty of Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries without ever learning Egyptian. Cleopatra was the first who did. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to speak the language of her own people. That single fact tells you everything about who she actually was. She did not merely react to history, she shaped it, calculated alliances, risked war, and twice stood at the edge of transforming the Mediterranean world. She came within weeks of outliving Octavian's ambitions, within months of seeing Rome itself kneel before an Egyptian queen. Why did she fail? Why did history bury her so completely? And what do we actually know about the woman behind 20 centuries of myth? The answers lie in sources her enemies tried to erase, in hieroglyphs, in Plutarch's careful contradictions, in the silence carved into temple walls across the Nile Valley. This is not the story of a seductress. This is the story of the most formidable political mind of the ancient world, and it begins not in a palace, but in a war. The story of Cleopatra cannot be told without understanding what she inherited and what she was born fighting to preserve. She was not, as centuries of mythology would have you believe, a native Egyptian. Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal house of Macedonian Greek origin that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Her ancestors were generals of Alexander the Great, men who carved up his empire at sword's point after his death in 323 BC. Ptolemy the Worsoter, the dynasty's founder, took Egypt not through blood right, but through military conquest, and he installed himself and his descendants as pharaohs, Greek rulers who draped themselves in Egyptian iconography while conducting their affairs in Greek and living in a city built to be more Mediterranean than African. Alexandria, the city where Cleopatra was born and would rule, was a marvel unlike anything else in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander himself on the northwestern edge of the Nile Delta in 331 BC, it was a city of perhaps 500,000 souls, a cosmopolitan metropolis that sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean, African, and Eastern trading worlds. Its great library housed hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. Its famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rose 130 meters above the harbor, visible to ships 30 miles out at sea. The city's Mausion was the ancient world's closest approximation to a research university, drawing scholars from Athens, Carthage, Babylon, and beyond. Mathematicians who calculated the circumference of the earth, poets who mapped the night sky, physicians who dissected the human body for the first time in recorded history. Into this extraordinary place, Cleopatra was born as the second child of Ptolemy XIII Auletes, a king whose nickname, the flute player, tells you something about both his personality and the contempt in which his subjects held him. Auletes was a weak ruler in a dangerously strong position. Egypt was the wealthiest nation in the Mediterranean world, the ancient world's breadbasket, producing grain that fed millions across the Roman Republic and beyond. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome had noticed. The Ptolemaic kingdom was one of the last independent states in the eastern Mediterranean, and its survival depended on keeping the Romans fed, flattered, and at arm's length. Cleopatra grew up watching her father perform this terrifying balancing act. Auletes had purchased his throne by paying enormous bribes to Roman senators, debasing Egypt's currency, and imposing crippling taxes on his own people to fund a relationship with Rome that his subjects found both humiliating and ruinous. The Alexandrian mob had already forced him into exile once, in 58 BC, when Rome annexed Cyprus without protest from the Ptolemaic crown. He fled to Rome, returning 3 years later with Roman soldiers to back him up and a debt of 10,000 silver talents he would spend the rest of his reign repaying. This was the Egypt Cleopatra was preparing to inherit. Not a strong, stable kingdom, but a nation financially bled dry, politically humiliated, and surrounded by an empire that was... To understand Cleopatra, you need to understand the Ptolemaic court she grew up in, because it was one of the most dangerous places in the ancient world. Royal succession among the Ptolemies was not a gentle transition, but a blood sport. Brothers poisoned sisters, mothers conspired against sons, daughters eliminated fathers before the fathers could eliminate them. The dynasty's history reads like a catalog of fratricides, infanticides, and spectacular betrayals, each generation producing rulers who had learned to treat family members as threats first and relatives second. Cleopatra's own grandmother had been murdered by her grandfather. Her great-uncle had been killed by his wife. Dynastic murder was not the exception among the Ptolemies. It was the operating norm. Cleopatra had at least 3 siblings, a younger sister named Arsinoe, and 2 younger brothers, both named Ptolemy in the Ptolemaic tradition of recycled names that added confusion to an already treacherous succession picture. All of them were potential rivals. All of them would, at various points, try to kill her or be killed on her orders. In a court where loyalty was a transaction and family was a liability, the princess learned early that survival required a combination of intelligence, calculated ruthlessness, and the ability to read people with absolute precision. What distinguished Cleopatra from her predecessors and her siblings was not ambition — everyone in the Ptolemaic court was ambitious — but preparation. She studied with a discipline that the ancient sources consistently note. She appears to have been educated at the Mouseion, Alexandria's great center of learning, where she would have had access to scholars of mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, medicine, and philosophy. She mastered Greek literature deeply enough that her own letters show genuine literary awareness. She learned to speak not just Greek but Egyptian, a profound departure from 3 centuries of Ptolemaic tradition, and one that carried enormous political significance. She also learned Aramaic, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks, Ethiopic, Hebrew, the language of the Medes, Parthian. Some sources credit her with speaking 9 languages in total. This linguistic mastery was not a cultural accomplishment. It was a weapon. In the ancient world, where translators were not merely inconvenient, but potentially treacherous, an interpreter who worked for multiple parties could shift alliances with a single strategic mistranslation. A ruler who could speak directly to every ambassador, priest, merchant, and soldier in their own tongue held an advantage that was almost impossible to overstate. Egypt itself, the kingdom she was preparing to rule, was in serious structural trouble. Decades of Ptolemaic mismanagement had hollowed out the state finances. The arrangement with Rome required ever-increasing taxes on Egyptian farmers, causing agricultural disruption and resentment that periodically boiled over into revolt. The Nile floods, on which the entire Egyptian agricultural system depended, had been irregular. And Rome watched, always watched, calculating when the moment to stop lending and simply take would finally arrive. Auletes died in 51 BC, leaving the kingdom jointly to Cleopatra, then 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy. For 2 years after Auletia's death, Cleopatra and her brother nominally ruled Egypt together, but the reality was a slow-motion coup. Ptolemy Thene's advisors, Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus, systematically stripped the queen of authority, sidelining her in administrative decisions, undermining her relationships with the powerful Egyptian priestly class that formed the backbone of the country's social structure, and cultivating loyalty within the Roman legions that Auletes had stationed in Egypt as a condition of his restoration. By 49 BC, they had moved against her directly. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt, probably crossing the eastern frontier into Syria, where she began assembling an army of mercenaries and supporters willing to fight for her restoration. The civil war between siblings was not merely a family quarrel over inheritance, it was a contest for Egypt's soul, and by extension, for the future of the relationship between the most valuable kingdom in the world and the empire that wanted to own it. The timing was catastrophic, because Rome's own political order was simultaneously collapsing around a conflict that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus, once partners in the first triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for a decade, had turned on each other. Their conflict consumed every province and client kingdom in Rome's orbit. Every ruler with a kingdom worth protecting had to choose a side, knowing that backing the wrong man meant annihilation. Ptolemy Thene's advisors made their choice. In September 48 BC, Pompey, decisively defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, fled to Egypt, seeking refuge from a king whose throne Rome's campaigns had indirectly secured years before. Pompey landed at the port of Pelusium on September 28th. He was invited to transfer from his warship to a small boat to come ashore, accompanied by only a handful of men. As he rose to step onto the dock, a Roman soldier named Septimius, now in Ptolemaic service, stabbed him from behind. His head was severed and preserved in brine to be presented to Caesar as a gesture of political friendship when Caesar arrived. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of the First Order. The advisors believed they were offering Caesar a gift, eliminating his most dangerous enemy before Caesar had even arrived on Egyptian soil. Instead, they had handed him a pretext for intervention and made themselves personally responsible for the murder of a Roman consul and general. When Caesar's fleet arrived in Alexandria 3 days later and Theodotus presented him with Pompey's head in a sealed container, Caesar reportedly turned away and wept. Whether from genuine grief for a man he had once called friend, or from cold political calculation about the image he needed to project, the ancient sources cannot agree. What is certain is that he made his displeasure unmistakably clear. He did not thank Theodotus. He did not reward Ptolemy. He moved into the royal palace and began issuing demands as though he were the ruler of Egypt, not a guest. He demanded that both Ptolemy III and Cleopatra present themselves before him to receive his arbitration of their dispute. He had, in effect, appointed himself judge over who would rule Egypt. Given that Egypt owed Rome an enormous debt and that Caesar commanded the most formidable military machine in the Mediterranean, his authority to make such a demand was not really in question. Cleopatra was still out. Getting into Alexandria without being caught was the central problem, and the solution Cleopatra devised has become the most famous anecdote in her entire biography. Repeated in dozens of ancient sources, immortalized in Renaissance painting, Hollywood film, and theatrical adaptation across 2,000 years, it has also been consistently misunderstood. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st century AD and drawing on earlier sources, describes Cleopatra being smuggled into the royal palace inside a bedding sack, sometimes translated as a carpet, though the Greek word used is more accurately rendered as a cloth bundle or bag. She was carried on the shoulders of a loyal Sicilian companion named Apollodorus, past armed guards who had no reason to question a merchant delivering goods to the palace. The bundle was brought to Caesar's private chambers. When Apollodorus unrolled it, Cleopatra stepped out. The image has lodged itself in the cultural imagination as an act of romantic daring, a seductress's theatrical entrance calculated to overwhelm a powerful man's defenses. Read it more carefully, and what you see is something entirely different. A calculated political operation, executed with extraordinary nerve under conditions of genuine mortal danger, designed not to enchant a general, but to create the conditions for a negotiation that could not be avoided or diluted by interested parties. Cleopatra was 21 years old. She was in a city where capture meant execution. She had to conceal herself inside a cloth container and trust her life to a single companion's loyalty and discretion. She was carried through streets patrolled by soldiers loyal to her brother's advisors, men who had already committed murder to maintain their grip on power and who would not hesitate to add a queen to their list. And rather than hiding in Alexandria and hoping for an audience later, she had herself delivered directly to the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world, in his private rooms, at night, in circumstances that guaranteed she would have his complete and undivided attention before he had the opportunity to form impressions based on her enemy's descriptions. It was not seduction, it was strategy. Caesar was 60 years old in 48 BC. He had conquered Gaul in 8 brutal years of warfare, survived a civil war that had torn the Roman world in half, and watched the political landscape of the Mediterranean reshape itself around his campaigns. He had dealt with kings, senators, generals, and foreign rulers of every variety. He was not a man easily impressed by surface charm. But what emerged from that cloth bundle, a young woman of 21 who addressed him in Latin without a translator, who was visibly in command of herself, despite circumstances that would have left most people paralyzed with fear, who had planned and executed a bold political gambit under conditions of lethal risk and pulled it off with apparent ease, stopped him. The ancient sources agree consistently on one point. What struck Caesar about Cleopatra was not her physical appearance, but the quality of her conversation, her voice, her confidence, the particular intellectual pleasure of engaging with someone who was genuinely his equal as a political thinker. They talked through the night. By morning, Caesar had committed to Cleopatra's restoration as co-ruler of Egypt. When Ptolemy XIII was summoned and found his sister already there, already allied with the most powerful man alive, the boy king tore off his royal diadem in rage and ran into the streets screaming that he had been betrayed. The Alexandrian War that erupted in late November of 48 BC was one of the most dangerous episodes in Julius Caesar's entire military career, and it came close to ending it permanently. Caesar had installed himself in the royal palace with a force of only 3,200 men. A small expeditionary party, not an army of occupation, while the tens of thousands of soldiers under Achilles' command controlled the rest of the city. When it became unmistakably clear that Caesar intended to restore Cleopatra as co-ruler, Achilles began moving his forces toward the palace district. What followed was months of savage urban combat of the kind that even the most experienced soldiers found uniquely brutal. Caesar controlled the harbor and the palace complex, but almost nothing beyond. He fortified his perimeter, drew water from wells within his defended zone, and sent urgently for reinforcements from the Roman forces stationed in the eastern provinces. The Alexandrian streets outside his perimeter were controlled by an enemy that knew the city far better than his soldiers did and had the active support of a resentful population. The harbor fighting grew desperate. Caesar's fleet in the Great Harbor was threatened by Achilles' naval forces attempting to seize his ships. In the confusion and fire, warehouses near the dock that stored papyrus scrolls likely intended for export rather than part of the Great Library itself, were caught in the blaze that Caesar's men set to prevent the enemy from seizing the fleet. Ancient sources have connected this incident to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria for 2,000 years, though the historical reality is considerably more complex. The library itself was almost certainly not destroyed in this single incident. Its decline was gradual, spanning centuries and involving neglect, funding cuts, and successive partial losses rather than one catastrophic fire. But the fighting was real, and its consequences were severe. At one point, Caesar was forced into the sea when an attempt to control the Pharos island went wrong. He swam to safety, allegedly holding important documents above the waterline with one hand, an anecdote repeated admiringly in multiple ancient sources, though doubtless embellished with each retelling. What is not embellished is that he nearly drowned. He was 60 years old in full armor, fighting a street war in a foreign city he had entered with wholly inadequate forces. Inside the palace, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe saw an opportunity. She was perhaps 16 years old, still a teenager, and she appears to have had the full complement of Ptolemaic ambition. She was smuggled out of the palace by a palace eunuch named Ganymedes and presented herself to Achilles' army as a rival claimant to the Egyptian throne. Achilles accepted her. Then Arsinoe had Achilles murdered and replaced with Ganymedes, demonstrating at 16 the family talent for political assassination. The decisive turning point came in the spring of 47 BC, when Caesar's reinforcements finally arrived. An army raised across the eastern Mediterranean and reinforced by Jewish troops under the command of Antipater of Idumea, father of the man who would one day be known to history as Herod the Great. With this relief force, Caesar broke out of his siege and defeated the Ptolemaic army. Ptolemy III, attempting to flee across the Nile, drowned when his overcrowded boat capsized under the weight of too many desperate men. The Nile journey that Cleopatra and Caesar undertook in the spring of 47 BC, a 3-month voyage upriver, traveling as far south as the first cataract at Aswan near the Nubian frontier, is an episode that most popular accounts of her life rush past or reduce to romance. That is a mistake. It was one of the most politically significant acts of her entire reign. The Ptolemies had always maintained the forms of pharaonic religion. They built temples, funded the priesthood, commissioned carvings in the traditional Egyptian style. But they had done this from a distance, as wealthy foreign patrons of a tradition they participated in performatively rather than genuinely. They were Greek rulers in Egyptian costume. Cleopatra was something different, and the Nile journey was her demonstration of that difference. To the Egyptian population, to the priestly class, to Caesar, and perhaps to herself. At Dendera, the great temple of Hathor that was completed during her reign and still stands today in extraordinary preservation, her image was carved into the southern exterior wall in the traditional pharaonic style. Enormous scale reliefs showing her performing offerings to the gods, dressed in the full regalia of an Egyptian king, with Caesarion depicted beside her as her divine heir. These are not the images of a Greek queen paying diplomatic tribute to local customs. They are the images of a ruler who understood Egyptian religious iconography with genuine depth and who presented herself to the Egyptian priestly establishment as the living incarnation of Isis, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and royal legitimacy. This identification with Isis was neither casual nor merely Egyptian. Isis was at this point the most widely worshipped deity in the entire Mediterranean world. Her cult had spread from Egypt into Greece, into the Italian peninsula, into the western provinces of the Roman Republic. Roman soldiers, merchants, and travelers had encountered her temples from Britain to Babylon. To be Isis was not just to claim an Egyptian religious identity. It was to claim a pan-Mediterranean divine status that transcended nationality. During this journey, Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's child. The boy who would be born in the summer of 47 BC was named Ptolemy Caesar, called by the Alexandrian public Caesarion Little Caesar. Whether Caesar formally acknowledged paternity is complicated by Roman law, which did not recognize children of foreign women as legitimate Roman heirs, and by the existence of Caesar's Roman wife Calpurnia, to whom he remained formally married. He never acknowledged Caesarion in any Roman legal document, but he never denied it either, and his subsequent behavior, including housing Cleopatra in his private villa across the Tiber during her visit to Rome, amounted to an extraordinarily public acknowledgement of a different kind. The Nile journey gave Cleopatra something she had needed urgently: the genuine support of the Egyptian priestly establishment. These were not merely religious figures. The great temples of Egypt controlled vast agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers, and possessed economic and social influence that no pharaoh could afford to antagonize. Previous Ptolemies had managed the priests through patronage and subsidy. Cleopatra earned their support through demonstrated devotion, linguistic competence, and what appears to have been genuine religious knowledge. She was 22 years old, newly confirmed as queen, carrying the child of the most powerful man alive. Caesar left Egypt in the summer of 47 BC, pulled back by the relentless demands of Roman politics and the military campaigns that never seemed to reach conclusion. He fought in Asia Minor, where his victory over Pharnaces the Setu of Pontus was so rapid and decisive that he sent Rome the famous three-word dispatch: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He fought in North Africa and in Spain. He was a man in constant motion, accumulating power with a methodical efficiency that was as much political calculation as military talent. But he had not forgotten Alexandria, and more particularly, he had not forgotten its queen. In 46 BC, Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs in Rome to mark his military victories: over Gaul, over Egypt, over Pharnaces, and over the Pompeian forces in Africa. These were elaborate, carefully choreographed public spectacles lasting days, in which captured enemies, foreign treasure, and symbolic representations of conquered territories were paraded through the streets of Rome before enormous crowds. Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe, captured after the Alexandrian War and transported to Rome, was displayed in chains among the Egyptian captives in the triumph. Something unexpected happened. The crowd, which had watched such displays with enthusiastic cruelty for generations, fell strangely silent when they saw Arsinoe, a teenage princess in chains, walking through the streets of a foreign city while crowds watched. The spectacle moved them to sympathy rather than triumph. Ancient sources note that many Romans wept. It was an early warning signal that the relationship between Roman citizens and Egypt was more complicated than the political class had assumed. Cleopatra herself was in Rome at this time. Caesar had invited her, along with Ptolemy XIV, her surviving younger brother and nominal co-ruler, and the infant Caesarion, to Rome in the previous year. He installed her in his private villa on the Trans-Tiber, outside the formal boundaries of the city, a technicality that allowed him to house a foreign monarch while technically respecting Roman laws that prohibited such residence within the city walls. But everyone in Rome knew exactly where she was and what her presence meant. The great men of Rome came to call on her. Cicero, who had opinions about virtually every person of significance in the ancient world and wrote many of them down, visited and later described the experience to a friend as disagreeable. He had hoped for certain books she had offered to send him from the Alexandrian collections. The books materialized. The queen was, in his estimation, arrogant. Given that Cicero was not himself celebrated for his modesty, this assessment might say as much about the encounter of 2 exceptional egos as about Cleopatra specifically. What Cleopatra saw in Rome told her everything she needed to know about the danger her kingdom faced. Roman politics in 46 to 44 BC was tilting visibly toward monarchy. Caesar had been named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, a title that transformed the old Republican office of emergency rule into something that looked disturbingly like permanent kingship. The idea that Rome might become a kingdom, and that the son of a Roman dictator and an Egyptian queen might one day inherit it, was not a fantasy. It was a live political possibility. And it was terrifying to the men who regarded themselves as the guardians of the Roman Republic. Among those men, a conspiracy was forming. Brutus, Cassius, and their allies were planning the act they would justify as the defense of Republican liberty. Cleopatra was still in Rome when Caesar walked to the theater of Pompey on March 15, 44 BC. He had received multiple warnings. What happened to Cleopatra in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination is one of the most uncertain passages in her entire biography. She was in Rome, in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, with a 2-year-old child whom the city knew was Caesar's son, surrounded by political factions that were suddenly in violent and unpredictable reconfiguration. The men who had killed Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, and their allies, had acted in the name of the Republic and controlled the initial momentum. The men who would avenge him, Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and consul, and Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son and heir, were regrouping. Neither faction had any particular reason to guarantee Cleopatra's safety, and both had reasons to find her presence inconvenient. She left Rome quickly, probably within weeks of the assassination. How exactly she managed the departure, what protection she had, what route she took, what she carried with her, the sources do not tell us. She returned to Egypt with Ptolemy XIV, her younger brother. Weeks after her return, Ptolemy XIV was dead. The ancient sources attribute his death to illness. Given the Ptolemaic tradition of convenient sibling mortality, and the fact that Cleopatra immediately elevated Caesarion to the position of co-ruler in Ptolemy XIV's place, few modern historians accept the illness narrative without reservation. The elimination of a sibling rival was simply too consistent with 3 centuries of Ptolemaic practice to be dismissed as coincidence. Back in Alexandria, ruling alone with her infant son named as nominal co-regent, Cleopatra spent the next 3 years in acute strategic uncertainty. The Roman world was tearing itself apart with a speed and violence that even recent precedent had not prepared anyone for. Caesar's assassins controlled the eastern provinces, the very territories from which Egypt drew its trading partners and diplomatic counterweights. Caesar's avengers were assembling forces in the west. The decisive confrontation everyone could see coming would determine who ruled Rome and what the winner would do with Egypt. In this period of maximum uncertainty, Cleopatra did what capable rulers do. She maintained all her options simultaneously. She sent resources when asked, made gestures of support toward multiple parties without fully committing to any, and focused relentlessly on Egypt's internal stability. The Nile floods had been poor in several consecutive years, a genuine disaster in an agricultural civilization that depended entirely on the river's annual deposit of silt and fresh water. Cleopatra managed the resulting food shortages with administrative competence that the papyri from her reign confirm in considerable detail: grain stores redistributed, taxation adjusted, public works maintained. The country held together. She was also deepening her public persona as the living incarnation of Isis in ways that went beyond Egyptian religious symbolism. Isis was at this point the most widely revered goddess across the entire Mediterranean world. Her cult had devotees in every Roman province. When Cleopatra presented herself as Isis, she was making a claim that resonated not just in the Nile temples, but in the streets of Corinth and Carthage and Rome itself. She was building a religious political identity that transcended any single alliance with any individual Roman, because she understood with absolute clarity that the alliances available to her were all temporary. What she needed was not a protector, What she needed was a position. The 3 years between Caesar's assassination and Cleopatra's encounter with Mark Antony at Tarsus were a period of radical political realignment across the entire Mediterranean world. In October 42nd BC, at the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia, Antony and Octavian decisively defeated Brutus and Cassius, both of whom committed suicide on the battlefield rather than submit to capture and the humiliation of a Roman triumph. The Republic's defenders were destroyed. What remained to be determined was how power would be divided between the victors. They divided it through the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC. Antony took responsibility for the eastern provinces, the wealthy, urbanized, culturally sophisticated half of the Roman world, from Greece through Asia Minor to Syria. Octavian took the west, including Italy itself. Both men understood this division to be temporary. The question was not whether the final confrontation would come, but when. Mark Antony was 50 years old when he began administering the eastern provinces. Every ancient source that describes him agrees on the basics: enormous physical presence, athletic build, genuine military talent, magnetic personal charisma, and a quality of personal excess that had been associated since his youth with the cult of Dionysus. In the Greek-speaking East, where Dionysus was a living cultural force, where Alexander the Great himself had claimed divine descent from the god, where theatrical festivals in Dionysus's honor shaped the cultural calendar, Antony's identification with the god was not a personal eccentricity. It was a political statement with immediate legibility across his entire territory. Cleopatra had calculated precisely what that meant. When Antony summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BC, ostensibly to answer questions about Egypt's ambiguous support for the Caesarian cause during the Civil War, Cleopatra chose not to arrive as a client ruler responding to a summons. She arrived as a phenomenon. Plutarch's description of her arrival on the river Cydnus is the most famous passage in ancient biography that does not appear in the Bible. Her barge's stern was of gold, its sails were purple, the color of royalty and gods in the ancient world. Its oars were silver, keeping time to the sound of flutes and lyres. Cleopatra lay beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed explicitly as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, whose Roman equivalent was Venus, divine ancestress of Julius Caesar's family, attended by boys dressed as Eros, fanning her, and women dressed as sea nymphs manning the ropes. The scent of burning incense drifted from the ship across the waterfront to the stone tribunal, where Antony sat waiting with his officials. The crowd on the banks abandoned his tribunal entirely. People flowed from the city to the waterfront to witness the arrival, until Antony sat alone, surrounded only by his own attendants, a Roman general who had just been publicly upstaged by the greatest theatrical entrance in the ancient world. Antony sent for her. She replied with an invitation to dine on her barge instead. He accepted. The staging was sophisticated political messaging, executed with theatrical precision that the most educated Greek-speaking population in the world immediately decoded. The dinners between Antony and Cleopatra on the barge at Tarsus that autumn marked the beginning of an alliance that would define the Eastern Mediterranean world for a decade and become one of history's most enduring stories, though calling it simply a love story flattens something that was, at its structural core, a calculated partnership between two people who recognized precisely what they could offer each other and what they needed in return. The arithmetic was not subtle. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector powerful enough to guarantee Egypt's continued independence in a world where Octavian was methodically consolidating control in the West. Antony needed money on a scale that only one kingdom in the Mediterranean could provide, not merely the personal wealth his famously extravagant lifestyle consumed, but the strategic financial resources of the richest state in the ancient world to fund the great Parthian campaign he was already planning. Rome's eastern frontier had been menaced by the Parthian Empire for decades. A successful campaign against Parthia would be the supreme military achievement of any Roman general's career. It would require Egyptian gold. But the calculation does not exhaust what was happening between them. Plutarch, who had access to sources from within Antony's own circle, is careful on this point. He notes that Cleopatra's beauty was not, in his judgment, incomparable, not the kind of beauty that strikes at first sight. What was incomparable was her presence in conversation. She was witty with genuine wit, not performed wit. She was learned without being pedantic. She challenged Antony's thinking rather than confirming it. She disagreed with him and explained why. She made the experience of talking to her genuinely, consistently pleasurable in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction. For a man accustomed to the deference of client rulers and the flattery of courtiers, encountering someone who would simply tell him when she thought he was wrong was evidently irresistible. Antony stayed in Egypt through the winter of 41 to 40 BC. They founded what they called the Inimitable Livers, a Greek cultural society whose name was a pun, meaning both those who live incomparably and those who live beyond imitation, and spent the Alexandrian winter in a sustained engagement with philosophy, theater, hunting, gaming, and the considerable pleasures of the most sophisticated city in the world. But amid the pleasures, the political infrastructure was being built. Antony provided what Cleopatra needed first. He ordered the assassination of Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had survived the Alexandrian War and was living in the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus in Roman-protected exile. The killing violated the sanctuary of a holy site in a way that shocked the Greek world. But Arsinoe was the last surviving rival claimant to the Egyptian throne, and her death removed the final piece of the succession problem. No Ptolemaic rival remained. Antony returned to Rome in 40 BC, summoned by a political crisis his own brother had created. The Treaty of Brundisium sealed his alliance with Octavian through a political marriage. Antony took Octavia, Octavian's sister, as his wife. She was by every account intelligent, dignified, and completely unsuited to the role being demanded of her. A living diplomatic seal between two men who both privately understood that the alliance would eventually end in the destruction of one of them. When Antony sailed for Rome, Cleopatra was in Alexandria, pregnant with twins. Antony returned to Egypt in 37 BC, and what followed represents the high water mark of Cleopatra's political ambitions, and the moment at which the conflict with Octavian became formally inevitable. She was now 32 years old, mother of 3 children by Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 BC while Antony was in Rome, and a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. And she was about to participate in the most audacious political ceremony in the ancient world. In Alexandria, Antony staged the event that became known as the Donations of Alexandria. Probably in 34 BC, following Antony's campaign in Armenia, which he had conducted successfully enough to bring the Armenian king back as a prisoner. He celebrated in Alexandria rather than Rome, a decision that was itself a statement, staging what looked suspiciously like a Roman triumph in a non-Roman city, with himself dressed as Dionysus and Cleopatra enthroned beside him as Isis. The ceremony that followed was extraordinary in its scope. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings and assigned Cyprus, Libya, Syria, and the territories of Armenia she had already been administering. Caesarion, by this point perhaps 13 years old, was declared legitimate and proclaimed co-ruler of Egypt, explicitly named as the son of Julius Caesar. This was the declaration that Octavian could not forgive, because Caesarion's legitimacy as Caesar's son directly undermined Octavian's own position as Caesar's adopted heir and political successor. The 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra were assigned kingdoms that existed, in many cases, mainly as Antony's ambitions. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and, with breathtaking optimism, Parthia. a formidable empire that had not yet been conquered and showed no signs of being easily persuaded. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrene and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus, barely 2 years old, received Syria and Cilicia, territories currently occupied by Roman interests. Both Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones in the great gymnasium of Alexandria, dressed as divine monarchs, while the eastern client kings of the region stood before them in attendance. It was a vision of the world organized not around Rome and its Senate, but around Alexandria and its divine royal pair. An empire of the East, co-equal with Rome, potentially superior to it in wealth and cultural sophistication. Octavian received the reports of the donations in Rome and understood immediately exactly what they were. Not merely a diplomatic provocation, not merely Antony's personal excess, a direct challenge to the entire framework of Roman imperial authority in the East, and an opportunity he had been waiting for. He went to the Vestal Virgins, the sacred priestesses who kept Roman wills in sacred trust, and retrieved Antony's will, which Antony had deposited there in the Roman tradition. He read it to the Senate. The will allegedly confirmed every suspicion. It wished Antony to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, acknowledged his relationship with Cleopatra and his children by her, and left specific legacies to Caesarion. Whether the will was authentic, partially altered, or entirely fabricated for political use cannot now be determined. What can be determined is its effect. The Senate was outraged. The declaration of war Octavian wanted was now within reach. The genius of his strategy was its framing. He did not propose war against Antony, which would have been another Roman civil war, a concept that Roman citizens had endured far too many times to embrace enthusiastically. The propaganda campaign that Octavian waged against Antony and Cleopatra in the years between the donations and the Battle of Actium was one of the most sophisticated and effective political communications operations in the ancient world. And it is essential to understand it clearly, because its echoes have distorted our understanding of Cleopatra for 2,000 years. Octavian's strategy exploited a simple but powerful insight. Romans could not easily be mobilized for another civil war. They had suffered through too many. The solution was to make the conflict not a Roman versus Roman struggle, but a civilizational confrontation, Rome and its masculine virtues against the corrupting, decadent, irrational East, embodied in a foreign queen who had somehow captured Rome's greatest general. Cleopatra became the villain of a story in which Antony was simultaneously the victim of enchantment and a traitor to his heritage. The accusations were specific and carefully deployed. Antony dressed in Eastern costume. He prostrated himself before Cleopatra. He was planning to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria. He had given Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. He had, in the most personally damning charge, abandoned his Roman wife Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for an Egyptian queen who called herself a goddess. Some of these charges were accurate. Antony had formally divorced Octavia in 32 BC. He was living in Alexandria with Cleopatra. The donations had occurred. These were real facts that Octavian deployed with devastating selective emphasis. What he systematically omitted was the political logic underlying each decision, that the Antony-Cleopatra alliance was fundamentally a strategic partnership in which Ptolemaic resources were funding Roman imperial expansion into the East, that the donations were an administrative framework for sub-imperial governance using client kingdoms as buffers against Parthia. The poets of Octavian's circle did the work of emotional amplification with extraordinary literary skill. Horace described Cleopatra as a fatal monster intoxicated with ambition, a Maenad whose defeat represented the triumph of Roman rational order. Virgil, in the 8th book of the Aeneid, depicted the Battle of Actium as a cosmic confrontation, with Cleopatra visible in the thick of battle, calling her ships amid chaos and barbaric noise, contrasted with the calm, divine order of Octavian's side, blessed by the gods of Rome. Propertius was more explicit still, describing her in terms that equated Egyptian royalty with prostitution and political seduction. These were gifted writers producing great literature. They were also producing state-sponsored propaganda. The images they generated, the dangerous Eastern queen, the bewitched Roman general, the triumph of Western order over Eastern excess, lodged in the cultural imagination with the force of poetry and proved extraordinarily resistant to correction by evidence. But the evidence exists. Temple walls across Egypt preserve Cleopatra's image in the pharaonic manner, performing religious duties with evident competence and genuine knowledge. Papyri from her administration, some bearing what scholars believe is her own handwriting, show a ruler deeply engaged in the details of governance. By the summer of 31 BC, the conflict between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra had been building for years through diplomatic provocations, senatorial maneuvers, and military preparations that consumed the resources of the entire Mediterranean world. The showdown would come at Actium on the northwest coast of Greece, but its outcome was shaped by months of preliminary campaign that had already tilted the scales decisively before the famous battle was even joined. On paper, the combined forces available to Antony and Cleopatra were formidable. They commanded somewhere between 400 and 500 warships and an army of perhaps 100,000 soldiers, supplemented by the financial resources of Egypt, the deepest treasury in the ancient world, which had funded preparations on both sides of the Mediterranean for years. Antony's legions included veterans of his Armenian and Parthian campaigns. Cleopatra had contributed a significant portion of the fleet from Egyptian naval resources and was personally present in the military headquarters, which was itself a matter of intense controversy among Antony's Roman officers. But the problems were serious, and many of them were structural. The most damaging was strategic disagreement between the two commanders about how to fight the war. Antony's military instinct and the strong preference of his Roman officer corps was to fight on land. Roman legionary tactics were the finest ground-fighting system in the ancient world, and on land they gave Antony a genuine advantage against Octavian's forces. Cleopatra's preference was for a naval strategy that emphasized mobility and the preservation of supply lines. Her reasoning was strategically sound. If the land army was defeated, all was lost. But if the fleet remained intact, Antony and Cleopatra could retreat, regroup in Egypt, and continue the war from a position of enormous financial strength. The disagreement was never fully resolved, and it produced a hesitation in strategic decision-making that Octavian's admiral, Marcus Agrippa, exploited with lethal efficiency. Agrippa was perhaps the most gifted naval commander the ancient world had produced. In the months before Actium, he moved with extraordinary speed, systematically raiding the supply lines and coastal positions that supported Antony and Cleopatra's land forces on the Greek coast. He captured Methone and Patrae, key resupply points, before Antony's forces could respond. By the summer of 31 BC, the Allied army was bottled up in the marshy coastal territory around the Gulf of Actium, where disease, probably malaria, was ravaging the land troops. Soldiers were dying faster than battles could kill them. Roman officers of experience and loyalty were defecting to Octavian's side. Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of Antony's most senior commanders, a man who had stood by him through years of war and politics, crossed over to Octavian shortly before the battle. Antony reportedly sent his personal belongings after him, a gesture of either remarkable clemency or calculated magnanimity designed to prevent further defections. It didn't prevent them. By September 2nd, 31 BC, when the battle was finally joined, the Allied fleet had been sitting in the Gulf of Actium for weeks, running short of supplies, weakened by disease, and demoralized by defections. The soldiers who rode Antony and Cleopatra. The Battle of Actium remains one of the most debated military engagements in ancient history, partly because the ancient sources that describe it disagree significantly on key details, and partly because what is at stake in the interpretation is whether the outcome represents military failure or a deliberate strategic decision made under conditions of already compromised position. The ancient sources hostile to Antony and Cleopatra, which is to say most of the surviving ancient sources, written after Octavian became Augustus and rewrote the history of the period, describe what happened as desertion and cowardice. Cleopatra's squadron broke through the Roman lines and made for open water. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and chased after her, leaving his fleet to fight alone and his officers staring in disbelief. The ancient sources friendly to Antony, fewer in number, less well-preserved, suggest a different reading, that the decision to break through and escape was the agreed-upon strategy from the beginning, based on the realistic assessment that a decisive victory was no longer possible, and that preserving the treasury and the core of the fleet for a continued war from Egypt was the best available option. On this reading, Antony did not abandon his fleet in a panic. He executed a fighting withdrawal that was always the plan. What is not disputed is the result. The Allied fleet, deprived of coordinated command, fought on for a time and then surrendered. The land army, waiting in its camps for orders that never came, held its position for 7 days before defecting en masse to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra reached Egypt. The treasury was intact. The fleet that had escaped was still functional. But the most important asset of all, the confidence of allies, officers, and client kings, had shattered at Actium, and no amount of Egyptian gold was going to reassemble it. The defections came immediately. The governor of Cyrene surrendered to Octavian. The client kings who had attended the donations of Alexandria quietly sent their compliments to Octavian's camp and waited. In Alexandria, each of them responded to the catastrophe differently, and the difference tells you something essential about who each of them was under pressure. Antony sank into a depression that ancient sources describe in terms that read, to a modern audience, like clinical crisis. He withdrew to a small structure he built on the harbor, which he named the Timonian, after Timon of Athens, the legendary misanthropist who hated all human company. He sat there alone and refused to see anyone, including Cleopatra. Cleopatra began working immediately. She initiated diplomatic contact with Octavian, explored every remaining option, and began moving the royal treasury to the great mausoleum she had been constructing near the Temple of Isis, preparing for the final confrontation with the calm, systematic thoroughness that had characterized her administration for 20 years. She also sent messengers to Octavian exploring terms. She moved Egypt's fleet overland to the Red Sea, an extraordinary logistical effort, intending if necessary to escape to India with the treasury and continue from there. The fleet was destroyed by Arab tribes loyal to Octavian before it could be launched. One of them was already planning for what came next. Octavian entered Alexandria on August 1st, 30th BC, with his forces in complete control of every approach to the city. The cavalry and fleet that had once protected Egypt's frontiers had gone over to him. The legions that had survived Actium had surrendered. The client kingdoms that had once formed the diplomatic network of the Eastern Empire had realigned themselves with the new master of the Roman world weeks before he arrived in person. Cleopatra was barricaded inside the great mausoleum she had constructed near the Temple of Isis, a massive stone structure filled with the royal treasury, her personal furnishings, libraries, and the accumulated wealth of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, along with materials for a fire that she had explicitly threatened to ignite rather than surrender. When Octavian's forces arrived at the mausoleum, she stood at an upper window with Iris and Charmian, her most trusted women, and made the threat explicit, set fire to it all rather than let him have anything. Octavian's response was carefully calibrated. He needed two things from Cleopatra: the treasury intact and herself alive, at least temporarily. A Roman triumph, the supreme celebration of military victory, a formal procession through Rome in which the victorious general displayed captives, treasure, and symbols of conquered territories, was the capstone achievement of Roman military culture. He had already paraded Arsinoe in Caesar's triumph, a triumph featuring Cleopatra herself, Queen of Egypt, the woman who had challenged Rome for a decade, would be the ultimate demonstration of his complete victory. He sent messengers with assurances of generous treatment, dignified captivity, respect for her royal person. He played for time. He came in person to the mausoleum and met her there. Contemporary sources disagree on the details of what passed between them. Octavian later described her as alternating between hysteria and seduction, weeping one moment and calculating the next. Given what we know about both of them, about Cleopatra's intelligence and Octavian's political sophistication, this account has a suspicious air of retrospective justification. The encounter between these two specific people was almost certainly a conversation between two exceptional political minds, each fully aware of what was at stake and what was possible. Cleopatra appears to have concluded, with her characteristic clarity, that there was no deal available. Octavian had not come to share power. He had not come to negotiate a place for her in his order. He had come to collect her. She was going to Rome in chains, to be displayed in his triumph, and then she was going to spend the rest of her life, possibly a long life as she was only 39, as a captive illustration of Roman power over the East. She asked permission to visit Antony's tomb. It was granted. She went, poured offerings, and spoke words that were not recorded, then returned to the mausoleum where she was being held under guard. She ordered an elaborate bath. She ordered a fine meal. She sent a sealed letter to Octavian. When Octavian's guards opened her chambers the next morning, they found her dead. Antony, in the final days before Octavian arrived, had received false intelligence that Cleopatra had already died. He had fallen on his sword in the gladiatorial tradition of Roman military suicide, and bungled it, lying wounded for hours before his servants carried him to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had. The circumstances of Cleopatra's death on August 12, 30 BC, are the most debated aspect of her entire biography, and they deserve careful examination rather than the romantic acceptance the ASP story has received for 2,000 years. The official account, promoted by Octavian and adopted by subsequent ancient historians, holds that she concealed an asp, an Egyptian cobra, in a basket of figs delivered to her room. She applied the snake to her arm, or according to some versions to her breast, and died from its venom. Her servants Iras and Charmian died with her, having applied snakes to themselves as well. When Octavian's guards burst into the chamber, they found Cleopatra dead in her royal robes on her golden throne, attended by her two dying servants. A guard asked Charmian, still alive in her final moments, whether this was well done. "Extremely well done," Charmian allegedly replied, "and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings." Then she fell. The story is extraordinarily beautiful. It is also, on examination, somewhat problematic. An Egyptian cobra, the species traditionally associated with royal iconography and the asp story, is a large reptile typically between 1 and 2 meters in length. Concealing one in a basket of figs, while not impossible, would require a basket of considerable size and a level of cooperative behavior from the snake that cobra behavior does not naturally support. More significantly, cobra venom does not produce the rapid, peaceful death that the accounts describe. Egyptian cobra venom is neurotoxic. It causes intense pain, progressive paralysis, and respiratory failure. But this process typically takes several hours and involves visible symptoms that Octavian's guards would certainly have noted. Strabo, writing within a decade of Cleopatra's death, and drawing on contemporaneous accounts, notes explicitly that no one was certain how she had died. He mentions the snake story, but presents it as one possibility among others rather than established fact. He also mentions that 2 small marks were found on her arm, marks that some medical scholars have subsequently interpreted as consistent with needle punctures rather than fang wounds. Octavian's reaction, when he received the sealed letter she had sent him and broke it open to find her farewell, suggests genuine fury rather than relief. He had Sili, Egyptian snake-charming specialists renowned for their knowledge of venom treatments, summoned in an attempt to revive her. They failed, or arrived too late. He then proceeded with his triumph in Rome using a painting of her death, complete with snakes. The image he had been denied in person, he recreated in art. The manner of her death, however exactly it occurred, was her final political act. She had denied him his triumph. She had controlled the ending of her own story. In the immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death, Octavian moved through Alexandria with the systematic efficiency that characterized everything he did. He visited the tomb of Alexander the Great, the crystal sarcophagus in the great mausoleum at the city's center, where the body of the Macedonian king who had founded this world lay in preserved state. He reportedly touched the mummy and accidentally broke off its nose, a poetically uncomfortable detail given how much later history would obsess over another famous nose from the same period. When his attendants asked if he would also like to see the Ptolemaic royal tombs, he declined. He had come to see a king, he said, not corpses. The remark was probably calculated for Roman consumption, but it also expressed something real. The Ptolemies were finished, and Octavian had no particular interest in the dead. What he did next with Egypt revealed how seriously he took what Cleopatra had built and how carefully he intended to manage what he had acquired. Egypt became something unprecedented in Roman administrative practice, not a province governed in the usual way, with a senatorial governor commanding legions and collecting taxes into the public treasury, but effectively the personal property of the Roman emperor. He appointed as its governor not a senator. Senators were too politically independent, too capable of leveraging Egypt's wealth for their own ambitions, but a member of the equestrian order, personally dependent on the emperor's favor. No Roman senator was permitted to enter Egypt without specific imperial authorization. The grain fleets that carried Egypt's harvest to Rome were placed directly under imperial control. Egypt was not Rome's acquisition. It was the emperor's treasury. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, now 17 years old, had fled Alexandria before Octavian's arrival, heading south toward India by the overland trade route through Ethiopia with a substantial portion of the treasury. Octavian sent agents after him. His tutor Rhodan persuaded the young man to return to Alexandria, arguing that Octavian intended reconciliation. It was a fatal lie. Caesarion returned and was immediately executed. The logic was cold and clear. As Julius Caesar's biological son, Caesarion represented the one remaining figure who could challenge Octavian's position as Caesar's heir. The 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra were treated differently. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome, where they were placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's abandoned Roman wife, Octavian's own sister, who raised Antony's Egyptian children alongside his Roman ones. It was either a remarkable act of Roman family solidarity or an exquisitely ironic final arrangement, possibly both simultaneously. Alexandria itself continued. The city remained one of the greatest urban centers in the ancient world for centuries after Octavian's conquest. Its philosophers continued to teach. The children of the alliance survived in different ways and to different ends. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, twin of Alexander Helios, grew up in Octavia's Roman household, received the education of a Roman noblewoman, and was eventually married to Juba II, king of Mauritania. the Roman client kingdom in what is now Northwest Africa. Juba was himself a remarkable figure, an African king educated in Rome, a historian and naturalist who wrote extensively about the geography and culture of his kingdom. Together, Cleopatra Selene and Juba II ruled Mauritania for decades, and the coins they minted survive. On those coins, you can see Cleopatra Selene's face. It resembles her mother's. The features visible on Cleopatra's own coins, strong and distinctive, a large nose, a firm jaw, the expression of a woman accustomed to command. In the faces on the Mauritanian coins, the genetic reality of the Ptolemaic dynasty survived into a new generation and a new world. Alexander Helios disappeared from the historical record after his Roman captivity. Whether he died in childhood, was quietly eliminated, or lived out a long, obscure life in some corner of the Roman world, no source records. Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, also vanishes from the record. Of the 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra, only the daughter left evidence of her adult life. In Rome, Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus, commissioned and promoted an enormous body of art and literature that celebrated his victory and established the interpretation of the conflict that would endure for centuries. The Aeneid of Virgil, one of the supreme achievements of Latin literature, depicts the confrontation at Actium as a cosmic battle between Roman destiny and Eastern chaos, with Cleopatra visible as a dark figure in the midst of barbaric confusion. The Odes of Horace include a famous poem celebrating Actium that describes Cleopatra as a fatal monster, now transformed by her death into something almost worthy of Roman respect, an enemy who at least died like a queen rather than being taken alive. The transformation of Cleopatra from dangerous enemy to tragic queen in the Augustan poetic tradition was itself a careful maneuver. She was safe to admire once she was dead, and once her death could be interpreted as Roman virtue's triumph. The living Cleopatra, the administrator, the diplomat, the linguistic genius, the woman who had very nearly bent the Roman world to her will, had to be reduced to a seductress, because acknowledging her actual capabilities would have raised uncomfortable questions about what Rome had feared. The rewriting was largely successful. For most of the 2,000 years that followed her death, Cleopatra has been understood primarily through the Augustan lens: beautiful, dangerous, alien, ultimately defeated. The documentary evidence that tells a different story. The question of what Cleopatra actually looked like has become a significant academic debate in modern scholarship. Not because the question is superficial, but because the gap between the legendary image and the physical evidence is so vast, and because that gap reveals something important about how history treats women in power. The ancient sources are remarkably consistent on one point, and it is the point that the subsequent popular tradition has most completely ignored. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st century AD and drawing on multiple earlier sources, including some from within Antony's own circle, is explicit on this subject. Her beauty, as we are told, was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her, but converse with her had an irresistible charm, and her presence, combined with the persuasiveness of her discourse and the character which was somehow diffused about her behavior towards others, had something stimulating about it. There was sweetness also in the tones of her voice, and her tongue, like an instrument of many strings, she could readily turn to whatever language she pleased. This description is as far from the Hollywood Cleopatra, defined primarily by physical beauty and sexual attraction, as it is possible to get. What Plutarch is describing is an intellectual presence, a voice, a quality of mind so singular that even people who came prepared to be unimpressed found themselves engaged. The physical evidence confirms a different image as well. The coins Cleopatra minted in Egypt, numismatic portraits that, in the ancient tradition, were formal royal representations viewed by every merchant, soldier, and tax collector in the kingdom, Show a woman with a large aquiline nose, a strong jaw, a pronounced forehead, and an expression of calm authority. Not conventionally beautiful by any standard, ancient or modern. Distinctive, commanding, unmistakably herself. A silver denarius minted during the period of her alliance with Antony shows both their profiles. Antony's profile is idealized in the Roman manner, somewhat flattering. Cleopatra's appears on the coin exactly as her Egyptian coins show her: the same strong nose, the same firm jaw, the same direct expression. Either she refused the Roman convention of idealizing the portrait, or she insisted on being represented as she actually appeared. Either choice tells you something about how she understood her authority. What was her ancestry? Almost certainly predominantly Macedonian Greek, in keeping with the Ptolemaic dynasty's 3 centuries of primarily internal marriage. The identity of her mother is not established in the ancient sources; she is simply not recorded, which has led scholars to suggest various possibilities, including Egyptian or other non-Greek ancestry. If her maternal line included Egyptian heritage, it would explain her apparent ease with Egyptian religious practice and language, but we cannot know. She was, by the most credible reading of the most reliable ancient evidence, a woman of average appearance and extraordinary presence. A linguist of genius, a politician of the highest capability, a ruler of genuine competence and remarkable longevity given the circumstances of her inheritance, and a woman who managed, through the sheer force of her intelligence and political skill, to remain a genuine partner rather than a mere client to the 2 most powerful men of her age for nearly 2 decades, against all structural odds. She inherited a dying kingdom at 18 years old and ruled it for 21 years through civil wars, Roman intervention, personal loss, and political reversals of devastating magnitude. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Cleopatra was the last of its rulers, and she was its most formidable by any measurable standard. She was the first of her line to speak Egyptian. She was the first to genuinely engage with the Egyptian priestly establishment as a fellow participant in religious tradition rather than a foreign patron of local customs. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to present herself with evident conviction and demonstrated knowledge as a genuine incarnation of the pharaonic tradition, not merely dressed in the costume, but inhabiting the role. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where her image is carved into the southern exterior wall performing offerings to the Egyptian gods, still stands. You can visit it today. The carved reliefs have survived 2,000 years, and the efforts of multiple subsequent cultures to deface or replace them. In those carvings, preserved in limestone, you can see what the Egyptian priesthood saw when they looked at Cleopatra. Not a Greek queen performing pharaonic theater, but a ruler performing sacred duties with evident knowledge and genuine commitment. The priests of Dendera gave her the full pharaonic titulary. They inscribed her name in a cartouche, the oval frame that in Egyptian tradition marked the name of a legitimate pharaoh. They recognized something real. The papyri from her administration tell the same story in a different register. These are not the records of a distracted queen too busy with Roman generals to govern her country. They are the working documents of an engaged administrator who read reports, annotated documents, resolved disputes, and managed the complex machinery of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated economies. The single Greek word, ginestoi, make it happen, written in a distinctive hand at the bottom of a governance decree in 33 BC, during the very period when her war with Octavian was building toward its climax, is the most evocative single artifact of her reign. A queen who was managing her kingdom's grain supply even as Rome prepared to conquer it. She failed, ultimately. Octavian won, Caesarion was killed, and Egypt lost its independence for nearly 2,000 years, until the revolution of 1952 established the modern Egyptian Republic. The vision she had articulated, of a Mediterranean world in which Egypt and the East were not subordinate provinces, but genuine partners in a shared civilization, did not come to pass in her lifetime. But the vision itself was not wrong. The Eastern Roman Empire that eventually emerged in Constantinople drew heavily on exactly the synthesis of Greek administration and Eastern spiritual authority that Cleopatra had embodied. The figure of the sacred queen, divine authority made human, political legitimacy grounded in religious identity, became one of the organizing ideas of Byzantine civilization. The world she had glimpsed and reached for came into being eventually, just not with her in it. History gave us the seductress because a seductress is easier to manage than the alternative. A woman of extraordinary intelligence who nearly succeeded in bending the Roman Empire to her will, and who, when she could not, chose the manner and meaning of her own ending with the same precision and deliberateness she had applied to every decision of her 21-year reign. Make it happen. She did. Until the very last.